Good evening, and welcome to Strange Slumber. I'm your friend Elaine, and today I'll be reading you to sleep with true and scary stories about people's experience working the night shift. If you like to go to sleep to strange or scary stories, go ahead and fondle that subscribe button and caress the notifications button and join me every week as I tell you stories that'll put you in a strange slumber. Now cozy up, get under the covers, and let's get started. I worked as an assistant in a morgue. As a med student, I got to open and study the bodies that people donated to the university. All the bodies were stored in a giant walk-in freezer. Also, the morgue had a motion sensor system inside the freezer. So if you get stuck inside, an alarm would activate and someone would come to help you. One time, I was working alone because my teacher was doing some paperwork in his office that was in an adjacent building. I heard a lot of noise, but I thought it was my teacher in the other building, when suddenly the alarm goes off, scaring the crap out of me. In that moment, I was like, oh no. The teacher is stuck inside the freezer. And when I was running to the freezer, my teacher grabbed my arm and told me, I thought you were inside the freezer. In that moment, we stayed there staring at the door until he stopped the alarm and opened it. I was behind him with a broom, waiting for the worst. When he opened the freezer, we didn't find anything that could activate the motion sensor. There wasn't anybody inside, at least not alive. We decided that it was enough for the day, and we left the morgue early. I worked overnights in an adolescent RTC for a time. About a week into the job, I was told about Amanda. Amanda was a resident from around 10 years prior who managed to hang herself in the shower. According to my coworkers, she would sometimes make appearances at night in the form of making a whimpering sound in the supply room, or, on very rare occasions, she would actually appear in the corner of the hallway nearest her old room. I blew off the story, thinking they were just messing with the new guy, until one night, about 2 months later, I was doing rounds while my partner took a smoke break. I was checking the kids were asleep when I saw a girl sitting in the corner of the hallway with her arms around her knees, which were pulled up to her chin. Something about her body language told me she was really sad. I started to approach her, but heard a noise from behind me. I checked to find nothing awry, and when I looked back to the corner, the girl was gone. When my coworker returned from his smoke break, I told him what I saw, and he said, yep, that's Amanda. I used to be a night janitor in a movie theater. We would go in at 4 a.m. and clean until the doors opened at 11 a.m. To save time and our jobs, we would sometimes come in around the time the last movies were finishing and just sleep in one of the empty theaters, making sure we would be there when the shift started. Our basic MO was to use electric leaf blowers up and down the aisles of each theater, blowing popcorn and trash all the way to the bottom and cleaning the seats up manually for anything gross or larger debris. This was expedient, but it was very loud, so it was easy to lose yourself in the work. Of course, the lights were on in the theaters to better assist in the cleaning, and usually we were the only ones there at the time, so whenever something strange happened, we would chalk it up to the other guy. There was one standing rule, though, that we all followed to the letter. No one in the projection booth. There was no reason to go up there. We didn't clean it. All our supplies were downstairs, and most of all, it was haunted. There is a phenomena that happens with theaters and projection booths, no matter what. You always feel like you're being watched. When you're walking around deaf, from the sound of the blowers in an empty movie theater, and you happen to glance up to the booth, and there is unmistakably someone standing there watching you, you will shit your pants, especially when you go out into the hallway and find the other guy in his theater working, especially when you both go to either end of the building to the two exits of the booth and trap whoever it was up there, and there is no one there. We chose not to fuck with it. I worked overnights at 2 different 24-hour residential treatment centers for teens, also known as poltergeist soup. We, the staff and clients, would see and hear things or people during the middle of the night, almost every night. I remember when I worked at a drug and alcohol rehab facility. It used to be a nunnery attached to a church. I used to hear women singing through our speaker that communicated with our doorbell for visiting hours. I could see the window of the door from where I would be sitting, and there was never anything there. I have a bunch more. Those places were full of weird shit. It was my uncle who used to be a cop in Hong Kong. He was patrolling the street on his own and received a smell complaint call from an apartment building nearby. So he reached the location and met the person who made the complaint and found out where the smell was coming from. He rung the doorbell. A little girl opened the door. As soon as the door opened, he knew someone had passed. The little girl is about 5 to 6 years old. My uncle was informed that there were only the little girl and her grandma living in the apartment. They were immigrants from China. My uncle walked into the apartment and noticed that there was a freshly made meal. He went to the room where the smell was coming from and found the woman's body. My uncle was puzzled by the freshly made meal because the little girl was not tall enough to reach the stove and the countertop. And it also puzzled him that a little girl could cook Chinese food, since it's pretty complex in their recipes. When my uncle asked the little girl who made this, she said it was her mother. Later, he found out that the little girl's mother passed from a stroke about a week ago. I worked for a university police department. One night, we had a call about some kids messing around in one of the old shut-down dorms they were trying to renovate. Me and my buddy get there and search the building. It was just 3 stories, so it didn't take us long to find these kids trying to have what I guess you could call a ghost hunt. They were on the 3rd floor of the building in an old dorm with cameras. So I asked what they're doing, and they said there was a story about a girl who met her demise in the dorms, and they wanted to record her voice on tape. Neither my buddy nor I believe in ghosts, so we laughed at them. I started calling in their information while my buddy was walking around the hall outside. Suddenly, we hear this blood-curdling scream coming from down the hall. My buddy goes to check it out, and I asked the kids if they had another friend. They told me no. I call for my buddy on the radio, and he doesn't answer. So I grab the kids, and we go down the stairs opposite where my buddy had gone, and I get them outside. I tried calling my buddy again once I got the kids outside, and he didn't answer. So I went to look for him. I kept all the kids' IDs in case they booked it. I found him on the 1st floor, shining his flashlight down into the basement. When I walked up on him, he just looked at me and said, "I heard footsteps down there." I told him we should go search it together. He told me no, and that he had just been down there and there was no one. We got outside and called for backup because my radio didn't work in the building, and got a couple more guys to search the building and didn't find anything. Still creeps me out to think about it. Verifying death is always sad, but my friend tells the funniest story and how creepy his first verification of death was. This is not meant to disrespect anyone. Black humor is a huge part of doctors' coping strategies. He was on a night shift a few weeks into his first job as a qualified doctor and got a call from a ward to say a lady had passed away. An unexpected death, hence he hadn't been called about her before, and could he come verify and do the paperwork. It's a busy shift with lots of sick people to see first, so he takes several hours to get there. He goes up and they tell him she's in room 8. The door to room 8 is slightly ajar, and the room is dark. Now, she was in a side room, but most patients there were in shared bays of 6 beds, so you get into the habit of not turning lights on. In his nervous haste to make sure it didn't look like he was nervous, he slipped into the room armed only with a little pen torch. The window was slightly opened, and he swears the blind rattled against the sill as he crept towards the bed, a tiny circle of light from his torch picking out the rumpled white hospital blanket, only a very slim rise showing where she lay, as she was a tiny old lady, just skin and bone. Finally, the light plays over her face, and he has to bite back a little scream, nearly dropping the torch. For whatever reason, her pose in death is one of a horrified snarl, lips drawn back to bare, likely false teeth, the whites of her eyes showing in a fixed blind stare, and both hands up close to her face, curled into claws, slightly over long nails shining grimly in the meager torchlight. Now, to verify death, the doctor has to listen for heart and breathing sounds for 2 minutes while feeling for a pulse, check for pupil reactions, and check for no response to pain. He flicked the torch dutifully across her glaring eyes, forcing himself to shuffle close enough to touch, first to check for a response to pain, and then to settle shaking fingers on her throat to feel for a pulse. To get a stethoscope under the collar of her gown under the blankets, he has to lean in even closer, almost nose to nose with her now, unable to draw his gaze away from hers. And he has to stand like that for 2 minutes, the seconds crawling away as he stares into that screaming face. He says there's no way he would have heard heart or breath sounds, even if she had been alive. All he could hear was his own racing heart in his ears, and on a loop in his head. Please don't let her move. Please don't let her move. Oh dear God, please don't let her move. Not my story, but a good friend of mine was the youngest recruit to pass police training in the area for a long time. At 19, he was fresh onto the service. I went for a pint with him a week later, and you could tell he'd seen things. So I asked him what it was like. He told me this one time they were called to a domestic. They got to the house and opened the door. Instantly, a whole load of sewer rats, not pet rats, flooded out. And there was no one home. The lights were on, the TV was on, but quiet, and the loud voices they heard arguing were just gone. The only life there were the rats that ran out of the house. They searched the house, every nook and cranny, and found no one. He and his partner for the evening stayed around for a while and waited to see if anyone came home. But after a few hours, no one came. The neighbors couldn't even explain it, so they left. A few minutes later, they got called to the same address, again by a different person, stating there's a pretty heated domestic going on. This time, they brought the dog squad to find the people. But again, the house was deserted. He said the freakiest thing was the toilet had blatantly just been flushed when they got there, as the cistern was filling and the kettle was now boiling. The dogs found nothing as well. To this day, he doesn't know what the heck went on. My old roommate's dad was a former naval officer and then FBI agent, 20 years in the Navy and 12 to 15 years or so in the FBI. One of his strangest stories was from his FBI days. A kidnapping case. This girl disappeared from her grandparents' RV sometime between 5 p.m. and midnight. They were up front. The next thing they know, she's gone. She was supposed to be sleeping in the back. One stop at a rest stop, then they were in stop-and-go traffic. So they figured she must have popped out the door at some point. This is near the California-Nevada border. So we meet them, talk to them. This is within about a day or so, and the girl's still missing. No sign of her. She was 15. Local PD theory is she ran off because she's 15 and wants to get away from her lame grandparents for the summer. But there's a busted window, glass, inside the vehicle, so we're treating it like a possible kidnapped person. After a few hours, there's a couple of different theories on the case. One is that she ran off. Another, that she got snatched. Nobody's seen the girl in almost 2 days, and disappearing in the desert for a young girl is tough. Next thing you know, we get a phone call. A naked girl, lost and confused, picked up by some trucker on a 2-lane road out there, runs into the I-15 between Barstow and Vegas somewhere, right near the border, and matched the description. Me and the 3 other guys head out there to meet with the sheriff who got her. Turns out she's our girl. She's fine. No rape, no bruises, no exposure, nothing. Completely healthy, completely fine. Even cleaned like she took a shower. Won't tell us a damn thing. Doesn't remember a damn thing. According to her, 1 minute she's in the RV, the next she's naked, walking down the side of the road in 100-degree heat. We talked to her for 2 hours while her grandparents headed out to pick her up. We had social services lady talk to her. Nothing. I've seen people hiding things. She wasn't hiding anything. She honestly didn't remember. Damnest thing. Anyway, girl was found. She was fine. So we turned it back over to local PD to figure out what happened and determined if charges were pressed. I kept in touch with a guy I knew there because I was curious, and we were in a fantasy football league together. A few months later, he tells me the parents sent the girl to a therapist to look for repressed memories, to make sure she wasn't raped. Therapist says she seems fine, but honestly had no recollection of her time at all, and doesn't think there's any point to delving much further, since she has no symptoms and is largely more confused by the reaction than the event. So to this day, we've got a busted RV window with a little glass inside, likely from a moving RV on a jam-packed freeway, likely in broad or lightly fading sunlight with 0 witnesses. A 15-year-old girl gets out or is taken out and is taken somewhere safe nearby for almost 2 days, and then stripped naked without being touched sexually, cleaned up, and deposited on the side of a separate road a few miles away. She didn't have a drug in her system that we could detect. She remembers nothing at all. Nobody knows what happened to her clothes or anything. Been almost 20 years since this happened, and I can't figure out what the hell went on with that girl. Still bugs me at night, and I have no way to explain it, aside from she lied the whole time. But I know liars, and I bet money she wasn't lying at all. We got a call to go out to a scene for an elderly woman with chest pains. We arrive at the house, and the front door is open. We knock, hear the old woman calling out from the back. I'm in the back room, in a very monotone and calm voice. My partner and I go back to the house looking for this woman, and that's when we smelled it. Nothing prepares you for the smell of rotting corpse. I've smelled it a dozen times, and it never gets any less disturbing. We radio for police and ALS backup as we move through the house. We opened the door to the master bedroom, and there is our patient. She is approximately 80, and she is staring at the master bathroom with these cold, dead eyes. She never once looked at us as we approached her and began talking to her. I got to the bedside and got in front of her gaze, and she just looked right through me. I turned around to see what she could possibly be looking at, and there was the source of my smell. A man, about the same age as my patient, was on the floor with very little left of his head still attached to his body. A shotgun lay on the floor next to him, and most of his head was strewn about the walls and bathroom counter. We loaded the woman up in the ambulance, and our police backup pulled up. I don't think that woman blinked once the entire time she was in our care. Totally screwed me up. A girl spent my entire 8-hour shift fist fighting the same ghost. She would throw a few punches and obviously landed knockout blows, so she'd bend over and twist her hand around like she was wrapping some long hair around her wrist. She'd drag her opponent down the hallway, give a few good kicks, then set up a curb stomp. Started off kind of funny, then gets a little disturbing when you think about the graphic things going on in her mind. Then it's just sad after you watch the replay for hours on end. I'm a doctor, but I am in the healthcare field as a dental hygienist. The creepiest, most confusing thing I've seen is as follows. We had a new patient come in for a cleaning. He was around 3 or 4, and Mom said he had never been to the dentist before. Not uncommon for what I see on a daily basis. So at first, I didn't think anything of it. I did his cleaning and then went up to take his routine x-rays. This is when the shit got weird. After looking at the x-rays, I could see that the child had already had a large amount of dental work done. He had around 6 to 7 composite, tooth-colored fillings. When I sat back down at my chair, I asked the parents again if he had ever been to the dentist. They were both adamant that he hadn't, and also there was no way a relative could have taken him without them knowing. What the heck? Well, how did this happen? Who took him? Where were the parents? Had they possibly been in jail for a long time and not known he was taken to the dentist by someone else and had work performed? What if this wasn't really their child and actually some kid they kidnapped? His insurance had no record of him having previous dental work, so that was a dead end too. I think about it often, but know that ultimately I'll never get an answer. I used to work in a care home for the elderly and took a couple of extra night shifts to pay for a trip abroad. Anyway, I was doing paperwork in the lounge at about 2 a.m., and all the residents were in bed. I saw a lady in the bottom corridor and recognized her as Jane. I got up, walked towards her, and said, "Let's get you back to bed, Jane." A voice behind me said, "Okay." I spun around and almost shit my knickers because Jane was sitting in a chair in front of the TV. No other residents in the unit were mobile, so I have no idea who or what I saw in the corridor that night. I have the creeps right now even thinking about it. I'm a night nurse in an ICU. Everything is creepy. From the many alarms to various gross liquids we spill all over the floor to the patients that die right in front of us. Still, the creepiest thing I can recall is the night I looked down the hallway and saw a 1-year-old child cross in front of our entrance door, all by herself, not an adult in sight. I rushed down the hall to inform any adult I could find that children weren't allowed in the ICU. I rushed down the hall to inform any adult I could find that children weren't allowed in the ICU due to too many infections that can run rampant through an undeveloped child's immune system. When I came to the front door and looked around, the child had disappeared and no adults were in sight. It was as if the ICU spawned the child and then took her back. I'll never forget one of my nurse colleagues who saw the child too and exclaimed, "That's a fucking baby in here." It's not constant overnight shifts, but sometimes I have to be at the office overnight during crunch times for big deadlines. The office is not big, and you can almost see the whole thing when you're sitting at the table in the back room. There's only one way in and out of the place, and since we're in the basement, the windows are too small for anything bigger than a raccoon to get through. It has its own quirks since it was built by a fraternal order in the 1920s and has some unique plumbing. But I've been there alone enough that the slamming door sound of the pipes and the whistling that comes through the front door are less disturbing. One night, though, I was alone and in the middle of getting a database finished. I had locked the front door, but as I was working, I heard the sound of someone pacing back and forth in the room behind me. It sounded like boots. I've never heard that sound before or since, and it was definitely coming from the basement, not the upstairs.